Welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast number 603. I'm Tom Cagley, your host. Today, we feature our interview with Austin Chadwick. Austin and I talked mobbing, but perhaps most importantly to me, Austin talked about the impact of finding joy in everything you do. The latter was one of those serendipitous discoveries that makes the interviews for the podcast so much fun. I hope you enjoyed the podcast interview as much as I did. Austin's bio. Austin is a passionate full-stack developer, Agile technical coach, conference speaker, and podcast, videocast co-host with experience in several roles: coach, developer, tester, scrum master, business analyst. He loves mob programming and working with people, technology, and teams to discover product development joy and continuous improvement. Are you ready to talk joy and mobbing? It's time for the interview. Austin Chadwick, welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast.
It's so excellent to be here. I'm really, really excited.
I am excited to have you on too. So this is actually fun. I have talked mobbing with Woody Zuhl. I know you are a preeminent practitioner, so I think this will be good for the listeners who, I think, sometimes don't quite get these things. So why don't we just dive into the deep end kind of thing? Let's talk about, well, better yet, why don't we start with what is mob programming? How do you define it? And then maybe why people are afraid of it.
Yeah. Those are excellent questions. And so I'll start with kind of three definitions. Two are kind of from the community. So we've been talking about it more recently, trying to say, hey, what is mob programming exactly? So it's kind of two of the community definitions that you'll find from people like Woody you've had on the show is all the brilliant minds working on the same thing at the same time in the same space and on the same computer. So that's kind of like the practical, actionable, like you can experiment with that and try it kind of thing. And then the kind of broader meta cultural thing going on is, let's work well together and turn up the good on collaboration and flow efficiency. So those are kind of some things we've been working out in the community. For me personally, mobbing pretty much just equals development joy. I had a ton of fun, in various roles from business analyst to developer to tester to scrum master in my career. And, had a lot of fun coaching and doing all those things. But the joy just really turned up like 10 notches as soon as I started mobbing. And our effectiveness, our learning, the fun, it's just, so that's mobbing just brings those emotions to mind for me.
Why fun?
Fun. So often, if you're like in a Scrum shop, you'll have a stand up and then you go work solo for a while. And then you maybe come to a refinement meeting. Well, with mobbing, you're with great people all day long, so if you're doing it in person, you're at the same computer, mob station. If you're doing it remotely, you're on a video chat, something like Zoom all day. And, great people just generates fun. So, it's fun to learn from brilliant people in the industry and with the work. And also you just get to know people and have fun with them. You start developing your inside jokes. We've been playing around with camera filters lately with the remote mobbing and having fun with that, so yeah, it's just fun to be with people all day. It's fun to get stuff done.
What if you're an introvert?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And actually, one of my coworkers, Aaron Griffith, we can put something in the show notes. He wrote an entire experience report on mob programming for the introverted. I think what often people think of as introverted is different than like the technical, psychological introversion. But basically, even people who, either definition, even people who are less social, they often have their clan or pack of people that they like being with and like talking with. And most people who have a job at a company know how to talk to people and know how to relate. At least a little, yeah. And from what I've found is almost, I would say probably on the area of 90% of the people I mob with full time over the last several years are on the introverted spectrum. And once they understand what it is and how it works and how to mob in a way that caters to that personality type where you don't fill in every empty void, you give them time to process, you have frequent breaks, that they grow, many introverts have grown to love it just as much as extroverts. So.
Yeah, it's funny. I have been involved with mobbing, albeit a little bit more promiscuous mobbing than anything else before. And and I'm a tad introverted, and I know that weirds people out just a hair, coach that's introverted, but it is important, right, to have those blank spaces and try to figure out, other than just doing it, is there a way to facilitate it so that people learn that mechanism faster?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always good to, I think mobbing, people are great and people often will figure it out. So if you just throw people into mobbing that haven't done it, sometimes that can work really well and sometimes not so well. But what I've seen often work the best is someone who's experienced and kind of help facilitate a mob.
Mm-hmm.
So I've seen that pretty much always work well. And so someone who knows to be like, hey, we're starting out mobbing for the first time, so let's set a timer. And often these timer tools have breaks, right? And so it'd be like, oh, so-and-so, you're up driving, and that means the other person is navigating. And so go ahead and start navigating, or if you need help, ask for help. And then what you'll start to notice if you're facilitating a mob like that is you'll start to find out who the dominators are, like myself, or the people who are quiet. And so one of the things we try to do is amplify the unheard voice. And so a good facilitator, or just typically a person who's more socially aware, will identify those things and either formally in a retrospective. There's a style of mobbing called Mobadero where it has built-in breaks and built-in short retrospectives that happen several times throughout the day. You can either do it formally or just informally. Someone will just speak up and say, we haven't heard from this person in the mob. They can just call it out specifically and say, hey, what do you think about this problem? Or there's more subtle ways to encourage others to share, right? And so I think and encourage the unheard voice. You can, when you're mobbing with someone all day, you can see their physical cues, right, of exhaustion or tired or frustrated, right? And, just being like, hey, how are we feeling? We're feeling a little frustrated. Do you want to take a break? Or, what's causing your frustration, and ask about that. And so it can go in many different directions, but essentially having someone present who's socially aware in the mob, usually through continuous retrospection, will iron out those issues. So.
The whole idea of being able to read body language, read the social cues, having that emotional intelligence, is that it has to be at least dampened down if you're doing this remotely.
You know what? I've actually been a recent convert on this. I actually think not. I mean, there is some loss. When you're doing it remotely. But I used to, be very much that in-person mobbing or in-person, software development is superior. But recent times has forced many of us to do remote full-time. And a coworker of mine said, before we were forced into it, said, yeah, and I've been doing a remote mobbing with friends on the weekend, and it's pretty much just like being there and with them in person, just like we mob all day in person. I'm like, really? And that fascinated me. And I think if you have the video always on and you're expressive and, you treat remote mobbing like if it was in-person mobbing. So when you're looking at the people, you look at your camera and talk to them, and you have the people's faces in that area, right? And so you talk to them as if they're actually there. And then when you look at the code, you look over to the code, or you look over to the screen with the Kanban board or what have you, right? And I feel like technically there's probably some loss, but it has not been noticeable at all once we got the tooling figured out.
But Austin, I don't want to have my camera on. The whole this whole being home in quarantine has been so unkind to me. I haven't had a haircut in 4 weeks. I've got hair growing out of my ear. I'm not turning my camera on. So are there absolute requirements? Do you think sort of bottom line requirements that if you're going to do remote mobbing, wow, what the heck? If you're going to actually do remote anything, that actually has to exist.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of my coworkers and actually co-host on the Mob Mentality show, Chris Lucian, had a good, what do you call it, the back off, the bandwidth back off pattern, which is essentially you start out shooting for high bandwidth mobbing, right? So which is video on, camera on, audio, chat system, all the various ways to communicate. and then you try to start with that, and then you back off and you inspect and adapt, right? And so, so not many, some people do full-time remote mobbing and don't have the video on, and they acknowledge that, yeah, it's lower bandwidth communication, but my internet service provider isn't working, or they have this or that reason, and that's fine. And even with just audio, it can still be very effective, but you do lose some of that stuff you would gain from in-person or video on mobbing, which is kind of the body language cues and other things like that. And also, it just feels more human and natural to talk to a face instead of an animated face than an icon of a picture they took 5 years ago that never moves, right? So.
And never is updated. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I understand that. Sort of like the picture of the Queen on the UK money. Every once in a while, every several decades, does that get updated? There are people who look at mobbing and run for the hills, right? So it is a frightening aspect. There's actually been fairly little true academic data, that I've read on it. There's been some, and it's usually fairly good. Why are people afraid of it?
Oh yeah, there's so many reasons to be afraid of it. Yeah, I feel like mobbing might be in the same camp as like the hashtag no estimates, right? Just even mentioning it might cause blood to boil, or stars to fall from the sky for some people, right?
I love putting that out on Twitter, because you're absolutely right. That will cause a storm of sorts.
Yeah, and I think there's several reasons. One is, if you look at it from like a traditional corporate efficiency perspective, it sounds like madness. It sounds like stupidity. You know what I mean? Like, it's the name of stupidity, because you could be having people getting stuff done all independently, and you get instead of 3 or 4 people working at the same time together mobbing, they could get 3 or 4 times as much done working independently, right? So I think that's one perspective of it, is it just seems like you're burning money and wasting money. And the other perspective of it is scary, right? Until you try it and see how it really is. I think a lot of people's mental model of it, of like, okay, imagine myself in a mob, what would that be like? And it sounds scary, right? Socially, for many people. I think more extroverted types are like, whoa, cool, let's jump in and do it. But for many people, it sounds like that is the opposite of what I signed up for when I decided to become a software engineer, right?
Well, in essence, you have to expose what you know and get real-time feedback rather than feedback. Even if it's a short cycle kind of feedback, it's delayed feedback. So it's easier when you're sitting there doing something and then having somebody looking over your shoulder and commenting on it, or giving you guidance. That can get, that can make your emotions do different things versus, hey, let's talk about it next week when I'm no longer emotionally involved with it, kind of thing. So there's that. I mean, which would you say was harder, to pair or to mob?
Yeah, I think in my experience, I love pairing, and we'll fall back to pairing often. For example, I mean, one of the benefits of mobbing is the code and the work keeps moving, even if I'm on vacation or I need to take a break or I had to take a call or whatever. So, in a mob of 3, you'll fall back to pairing, or in a smaller mob of 4 to 5, you'll fall back to pairing here and there. And I love pairing. I think it's fantastic. But to answer your question directly, I think mobbing is easier.
Okay.
Basically because the cognitive load is lower, right? So when you're mobbing, you often automate all the low cognitive load things. Like anything you just manually do, a mob will typically automate that away, because you have all that brain power, and you just say like, hey, instead of doing this manual update every day or rewriting the same code 500 times over and over again, let's make a generator for that or whatever, right? And so often mobs will end up having very high cognitive load work because all the simple stuff is automated away. And so when you have high cognitive load, it's difficult when you're solo to bear that. And then when you're pairing, you're bearing it with someone else. But with 3 or more, those difficult problems became way more simple. So if you're you're interacting with some legacy code that doesn't have the safety of automated tests and refactored code, and it's not very readable. If you have people in the mob who someone's a specialty in the domain and somebody's a specialty who's been around the block with this code before, and then you have someone who's really excellent at the language, right? Or if it's more DevOps related, someone who's more familiar with the cloud and continuous delivery, to get a mature feature to production, it takes all of these mindsets, right? And for any one person to have all that, to move a car all the way to production is a lot. And so when you're working together, you contribute your part, and then you just see everyone else's ideas kind of meld into the code, and you don't have to bear it alone, right? And so someone might be navigating for a while on, okay, what this code means is this. And it's hard to understand that, but I can tell you that because I have the history. And then while they're explaining that, you're thinking like, okay, I know what refactoring to do next, or I know what test to write to expose the bug or whatever. And so it just takes the stress that I would often feel in solo work and sometimes with pair work, and it just kind of distributes it, right? And it's just way more enjoyable and, in my opinion, way more efficient. Yeah.
So what does a typical mob look like in terms of skill sets?
Yeah. So in my experience,
there is such a thing as typical, right?
Yeah. So from my learnings from others, miles vary all over the place, but obviously diversity is a big value in mobbing because you want the multiple perspectives, diversity in every sense of the word. So in my experience, typically it's been somewhat heavy on the tech front. So typically software developers, but different specialties in that, right? And so some people have a really strong facilitation bent on encouraging the team to retrospect, emotional intelligence, those kind of things. So typically there's someone like that in a great mob. And then there's different skill sets technically. So there is someone who's more DevOps, continuous delivery, pipeline oriented. And so they may be more on the learning front when we're, writing the feature. But when it comes to deploying it to production and integrating that new architecture in the pipeline to deliver, they shine, right? And so they kind of lead the charge there, but then they're learning on the other stuff. And then there's like low level programming versus high level. So someone in my mob right now has a history of firmware, and low level programming. And when we get to those points of the code, it's so nice to have them in there. There's typically, someone more clean code, refactoring minded, which is really great to make the software maintainable. And then there's, someone more domain oriented who helps keep the team on track. Like, hey, we started working on A, now we're on D, and that's really cool engineering wise, but hey, what's going to deliver value to the customer? Let's look at the Kanban board and, refocus. And actually there's a great mob programming RPG game, if you haven't heard of it, developed by Willem Larsen. And you can try it out with your team and try out mob programming, but it helps you put on various different roles that happen in a mob while you complete a simple exercise. And you get points for completing the role. So
everybody likes points.
Yes. Oh.
What do you do with a team that has non-technical people embedded?
Yeah, and that's actually something I forgot to mention is the non-technical people. And actually that's what I've seen less in mobs, the non-technical person. And it is actually probably, if not the most important, one of the most important roles to have in there to achieve flow efficiency, right? So the non-technical person either contributes from like a coaching, emotional intelligence perspective, or they're like a marketing product owner-ish type person, right? Mm-hmm. And so, one of the benefits of mobbing is flow efficiency. And so to eliminate queuing time between like, hey, we need to know what to do. We thought we were going to do A, and then we're looking at the code and trying to change it. And now the landscape has changed and we need to know what to do next. Having that product person, marketing person in the mob, or at least on the edge of the mob, so we can bring them right in and they can mob with us for a little bit, is so beneficial because you don't need to wait for the next meeting. You just ask them and then you know what to do and move on, right? And they can tell you like, oh, per feedback from the users I've gotten recently, let's go this direction and not this direction. So I didn't answer your question. So your question was, what do you do to help them? Can you rephrase the question again? Sorry.
Other than sitting there providing that context level support, they're probably not going to drive a keyboard how do they fit in as the team continues to mob?
Yeah, and what I've seen is it varies on that type of non-technical person. So some are all about it. They'll jump in and they'll be, we'll tell them like, hey, it's great. We love having non-learners. I've mobbed with people who've never written a line of code before. And so they'll jump in and they'll jump on the keyboard, and what we tell them is you have nothing to worry about because we'll tell you exactly what to type. And so, if they've never written code before, be like, okay, go to line 10, type this word, space, this word, open, close parentheses. And in a short amount of time, they start to get the basic mechanics and they drive better. And then when they're navigating, they don't necessarily need to speak code. They can just speak high level intent and say like, hey, I know we need to get this data from over here and make it show up on the screen. And then they can ask the other mobbers, how do I do that? And they'd be like, okay, what you want to do is make a function. Mm-hmm. And then they'll start to learn how to navigate. So that's definitely not the majority, but some people fall in that camp. And others like to be what we've called in the kind of the mob programming patterns world is kind of being at the edge of the mob. So they like being around the mob, but not necessarily participating in the rotation all the time or some of the time. And so, in person, that would mean they would be in the same building, but just around and ready to help. And they're kind of in context and they're kind of overhearing the conversations and can jump in when they hear something. Remotely, that's a little bit of a harder shell, but at any time I can invite someone into our mob and boom, they're in our video chat session and they're looking at our same screen and we can show them what's happening. And so we have several people like that who are, maybe in a different tech stack that we interact with in the architecture, or they're more a product person. And then we just bring them in and they're happy to contribute and be a part of it and then go back to the edge of the mob when they're done. And so I think just finding out what works for your context. Yeah.
Well, that makes sense. You used a term that people might not immediately understand well, and that's flow efficiency. Why should we care about flow efficiency? Shouldn't we really care about resource efficiency?
Yeah, great question. And so, I could probably send you an excellent short TED Talk on it. But for what it means to me is flow efficiency versus resource efficiency. And this has so much to do with mobbing. So resource efficiency for me is keeping people busy, right? So if I look in a room and I see, I've even heard some managers talk this way. I see a room full of developers and they're all on their keyboard typing. And there's no like, waste, so to speak, in their activity, right? They're always doing stuff. They're always active, right? They don't have any slack, right? And so I think kind of the more negative example is like a freeway and the freeway is completely full, right? There are cars in every lane. And as far as you can see, that is, that freeway is fully utilized from a resource perspective. And then flow efficiency for me is getting stuff done and giving value to the customer. So making that the most important thing. So kind of going back to the Agile Manifesto is delivering frequently valuable working software to customers, right? And so from that perspective, if you make that priority, keeping people busy individually may not be the fastest way there, right? So for me personally, like I went from traditional, very waterfall to a Scrum shop and now to kind of mob programming environment, which is more Kanban and flow based. And from what I saw from the Scrum shop is a lot of people doing solo contribution in their lane, front end, back end, tester, DevOps, etc. And then they get their work done. And then there's all these queues of waiting, right? So I got to get a code review. It's got to be approved by the product owner. And so they do their work and then they wait and then they pick up something else. And then so you're picking up more and more and more things in progress. And while everyone is very busy and it looks like we have a lot of people getting a lot of stuff done, the actual card of here's the valuable thing the user needs, is that in production where they can use it and give feedback to us, right? And so going from that, which had kind of a more air of resource efficiency, to mobbing, where you have a lot of those people working together, the big difference you see is I still think there's high resource efficiency. We're all busy, but cards just get done way faster because there's no more wait and waste in queuing. It's just, hey, we have the idea from the market, from the feedback, we implement it, we review it live, we run our automated tests, we test a little bit manually if we need to, and we push it to production and it's done. And then we move on to the next thing. There's no waiting. So that's what comes to mind to me between resource efficiency and flow efficiency.
You think that is one of I'm trouble. Yeah, I don't want to bash management, but as a common perspective, that's got to be one of the problems that they see, or at least perceive, that everybody's not 100% committed. And even if they recognize that everybody can't be 100% committed all the time, otherwise they're lost anyway, everybody's not working on something different.
Yeah. And I'm totally guilty of that mindset until I just experienced it, right? I mean, before, I don't know, 5-10 years ago, you asked me, hey, what's more efficient? I would immediately think of resource efficiency. I think that's just, my bet is it's, not the fault of anybody. It's just, that's what comes to mind from our education background environment of what efficiency means, until you really see that, hey, that isn't the most important thing to delivering value to customers, right? And how do we work differently with a different priority for flow?
I think a good look at Kanban, it actually resets that, and the whole idea of throughput and flow accounting, and whether it's Kanban or some of the stuff that Steve Tendon has done, those I think really take a hard look at the whole idea of resource efficiency. How did you get there? I mean, sounds like it was waterfall and then Scrum and now Mob. What took you down this path?
Yeah, so my journey is pretty fun one for me. It's been a really fun experience because accidentally, serendipitously, I've been in various different roles and all the different types of methodologies over the past 15 years. And so, I started out of school at a nuclear power plant, right? So you talk about regulation and procedure and waterfall. And so, and so it was kind of in a more traditional role, like a business analyst, right? And did a little bit of development. And then, and so I learned about, I'm very fortunate. I've learned I'm very rare in this category. My education in the University of Computer Science did some Agile training. So that is incredibly rare.
Yeah, it is rare.
Yeah, so we talked about, the manifesto and then even on the technical side, what test-driven development and refactoring is about, and, continuous integration. So I had that seed in me. And so in that very traditional environment, I did what I called like covert Agile, where, the procedures and laws were written in a very waterfall fashion. But near the end of it, I was sitting next to the customer and being like, hey, what do you think of this? All right, cool. You know what I mean? And the procedure wouldn't necessarily specify in time when things had to do, so I would kind of do things in parallel. And so that was my first kind of experimentation with that, and feeling how much better that was than sitting and writing a document for 2 months, handing it over for someone else to write the code, and then they'd write the code, and then I would test it for a month. You know what I mean? And yeah, and so
I've been there.
Yeah. So, and then at the next place I went to, I joined as kind of like a quality engineer type, but it was a from scratch waterfall to Agile transformation, which turned out to be a lot of Scrum. So that was some great growth for me. And your show was a big part of that, part of my transition. So as we were joking earlier before the show, it's funny to hear your voice and actually talk to you and not just be listening to your podcast. But so that was a great inspiring moment. Your podcast and several others kind of opened my eyes to doing things. What does it look like to live and work in a more agile way? And what mindset is that? And so we went from kind of a undefined waterfall to a what I felt like was a great leap forward for that organization, and kind of grew into a tester, developer, coach role. And then a part of that was training on extreme programming. And so part of that training, and this is kind of goes back to people's reactions to pairing and mobbing, but the trainer was talking about pair programming and quoted Llewellyn Falco. And it was for an idea to get into the code, it's got to go from your head into the code. It's got to go through someone else's hands, right? And so someone stood up in the class and said, that is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard in my life, right?
I see that happening. Yep.
Yeah. And so the trainer handled it very well. But while he was talking about pairing, he also mentioned, hey, there's this place, and it's actually down the street from you guys, that does this thing called mobbing, and it's fantastic. And then showed us a video of it. And our team was inspired. I was very inspired. We ended up hiring someone who used to work there. It's Hunter Industries.
Mm-hmm.
And and then he started sharing with us and the team about it. And then we said, like, okay, we had a retro. Who's interested in applying some of the stuff we learned from training, whether test-driven development, pairing, mobbing? And a subsection of the team said, hey, we want to try this out. And so we had a from scratch budget mob station from junk equipment in the garage of the company, right? So, we had like the cheapest TVs you could buy from Amazon and old computers from this or that, right? And we started experimenting with it, and I absolutely loved it. And I think a lot of the amazing things about lean and agile and flow efficiency just kind of come for free when you start mobbing. And so that was part-time mobbing, and now I've switched to a place where we full-time mob, and it's fantastic. So that's kind of how I got from where I was to where I am today.
The person who jumped up in the back of the room and said, "That's the craziest thing. Whatever happened?"
Yeah, so this kind of plays into kind of diffusion of innovation theory, right? So you have, for any innovative or different or new idea, you're going to have people who are going to be in the late majority, if ever, right? And then you have people who are excited to try new things, right? And then people who are somewhere in the middle are going to see, I'm going to see how it goes for those crazy people. And if it works out, then I'll try it, right? So I think for that person, he was later on the late majority or never. I don't know what happened to him, but he wasn't in the early group that was trying it out. But and that's okay. And I think that's a fantastic thing about continuous improvement, is if you do it in a voluntarism style, everyone doesn't have to be on board. You just, the people who run the experiment, give them the resources and ability to do it,
Until the experiment takes over the organization. And then people have to choose to be on or off the bus. And that sounds hard, but at some point, even if you're not forced off an edge of a cliff, sooner or later erosion takes care of that kind of thing.
Yes. Yeah, that has happened as well. Not with that specific example, but I've heard of places who have gone through that, right? Where it has been so successful and people have really liked it so much that pretty much everyone is mobbing now or pairing now. And then you're that one person left, and some people leave. It's not for them, and I suppose that's okay. But it was a natural evolution, as opposed to me manager, me director had a great idea. Everyone is doing it now, and I've even seen that work out well sometimes. But it's not my preferred style.
Yeah, it's not my preferred style either. And very frankly, if you're an organization, let's just pick on just basic Scrum. If you're just now in 2020 starting to think about doing some Agile stuff, you're in the way late adopter. You may be close to the never folks, and having that top down, just an edict, generally doesn't work at that point. That point, you've got all sorts of other interesting change management kind of scenarios.
Yeah.
Austin, this has been absolutely fantastic. I've enjoyed it. There's probably another several hours that we can go, but I don't. We can do that again at some point. But before we go, if you woke up tomorrow morning and someone handed you a cup of coffee or tea person, what's your caffeinated beverage of choice?
Yeah, so I used to be the frou-frou coffee, sugary stuff, but now I'm black coffee, so I'm, more macho.
Okay.
No, I've grown to like black coffee after having kids. So kids have made me just get more efficient. Just drink the caffeine straight. Don't put anything in it.
Yeah, it's a whole lot longer to actually make the high-end coffee drinks than it is like, oh my God, French press or even the Keurig thing. Just give me the. So somebody hands you that cup of coffee. It's nice and strong. Matter of fact, it's 10 ounces of espresso all at once and a magic wand, and gave you two wishes and said, what are the two things that you want to change that would add value or make adding value better, faster, whatever? What would those two things be and why?
Yeah, so one's probably more expected and two will kind of be out of left field, philosophical. So for the first one, it's kind of a lot of what we're talking about. And in the way I like to put it is, development joy is how I seek it. Seek to treat people exceptionally well in your context. and seek to continuously retrospect and experiment. And for me, mobbing has really made that just amplified to be incredibly fun, effective, and just learn so much. So yeah, just try it out, see what it looks like in your context, inspect and adapt. And then the second thing is a little bit more philosophical. So a different side of me a little bit is learn from the past, to put it succinctly. So one of my favorite authors, and a quote from him is C.S. Lewis, is like, "In reading great literature, I become 1,000 men and yet remain myself." And what I've come to realize over the last couple of years is that everything that pops up in business and Agile and interpersonal and a lot of stuff that's kind of buzzing around the internet in our industry just pretty much seems to be rediscovery of things discovered a long time ago and then forgotten. And most people don't, learn from the past. And so it's like, oh, wow, I did this experiment. Here's this brand new thing. So it's kind of a hobby of mine to read classics. And so not only reading stuff from industry from 50 to 100 years ago, but reading classical thought, classical books, great books. How much of that stuff has been in humanity for a long time, and reading that stuff forms you to kind of live that way naturally in your work environment. And so I see a huge synergy between classical thought and Agile and lean and all these things. So for me, it's just kind of like learn from the past and maybe pick up something that you would think is too ancient to be useful.
Yeah, I don't know that there's anything that's too ancient to be useful. There's stuff that is probably just not useful, but might not have been useful then either. C.S. Lewis, definitely more than just the books of Narnia.
Yeah.
Read a little bit of Lewis. How would people continue the conversation?
Yeah, excellent. So for me personally, I have a LinkedIn profile, and we can put that in the show notes, and that's a great way to reach out to me. And then, me and Chris Lucian have been... What's that?
You have a podcast.
Yes. So probably my favorite way to be reached right now is via our podcast and YouTube channel. So it's called The Mom Mentality Show. We just had our 1-year anniversary. So so it's been a lot of fun. We've been publishing weekly on YouTube and on podcast. And basically we talk all things Agile and product development from a mob programming perspective. And so we'll hit various topics about mobbing specifically practices. We'll hit kind of meta cultural, Agile, lean stuff that needs to be in the environment to help product development go great. And we've interviewed people from all over around the world who are mobbing, and they're sharing their experiences. And so, so you can reach out to us on Twitter, and that's a good way to tweet or direct message us.
We will have all of that contact information in the show notes. Anything else you'd like to promote before we wrap?
I think those last two things cover it. Yeah. So, try mobbing, give it a shot, inspect and adapt.
And listen to the Mom Mentality podcast.
Yes.
Austin, this has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you for sharing with the Software Process and Measurement Cast.
Yeah, thank you so much for being on. It's it almost feels like a dream, like, oh, I've listened to it so many times to actually be on it. So the pleasure is all mine. So thank you.
You're welcome. And we'll do it again. In Reread Saturday News, this week we tackle Chapter 1 in our reread of Tame Your Workflow by Steve Tendon and Daniel Doiron. Chapter 1 lays out the 4 flows which the book explores in detail and begins a deep dive into the power of mental models. The chapter also touches on one of the great evils of modern times, multitasking. Need I say more? Remember, buy a copy of Tame Your Workflow to support the authors in the blog. In the Software Process and Measurement Cast number 604, we will feature our essay on preparing for software development after the COVID-19 disaster abates. Continuous improvement can't be just a slogan during an economic downturn. We've also a visit from John M. Quigley with his Alpha and Omega product development column. If process improvement is a never-ending journey, why do so many people ask, are we there yet?